Fisch und Fusch und Fisch und Fusch, Fisch und Fusch und Fisch und alles. Fisch und Fusch und Fisch und Fusch und Fisch und alles. Fisch und Fusch und Fisch und Fusch, Fisch und Fusch und Fisch und alles.
Today we're diving into the concept of race, and we're going to look at it from different angles. Now, some people think race is a straightforward thing, maybe based on skin color or where you're from, but it's actually a lot more complex. First off, let's talk about the idea that race is biological. It has been around for a long time. It's the notion that the human species can be divided into separate races based on physical characteristics. But here's the thing. Scientists who've looked into our DNA found that all humans are 99.9 identical at the genetic level. That means that the idea of race being biological, well, it doesn't hold up. Or you might wonder, if it's not biology, then what is it? Here's where it gets interesting. Race is something that society has made up. Let's think about it this way. Why do we consider some people white or black or Asian? The answer often lies in how society has chosen to categorize people based on certain features. And these features can be anything from skin color to the shape of your nose or the texture of your hair. But here's the kicker. These categories change over time and can be different depending on where you are in the world. For example, someone considered white in one country might not be seen that way in another. So if race isn't biological, why do we still talk about it like it's a real thing? Well, that's because it has real effects. Society treats people differently based on how they're categorized. We can see this in many areas, jobs, schools, and how the law works. Just think about how different communities experience everyday things like getting a job or an education. All of this is influenced by how society thinks about race. Now let's think about the concept of race from a historical perspective. If we go back a few hundred years, we see that the idea of race was often used to justify some pretty bad stuff like slavery or taking away land from native people. And those ideas didn't just disappear. They still affect people today. Thinking about stereotypes or prejudices that exist. Where do you think they come from? They come from these old ideas about race that have been passed down through generations. Another thing we need to look at is the link between race and culture. Sometimes people think that if you're from a certain race, then you must have a specific culture. But that's not true. Culture is about traditions, language, and a lot of other things that people learn from their family and community. Race and culture can be connected, but they're not the same thing. A person from the same racial background can have a completely different culture depending on where they were born or raised. So to sum it all up, race is a complex idea. It's not based on biology, but it's something that society has created. It changes over time and place, and it has a real impact on people's lives. It's linked to history, and it's often mixed up with culture. As we go through this course, we'll see that while race might be a made-up concept, we can't just ignore it because it plays a big role in how society is structured and how people are treated. All right, everyone. We've covered quite a bit about what race is, or rather what it isn't, and how society's ideas about race affect us in so many ways. Now let's move on to another term that often comes up in conversations about identity and diversity, and that term is ethnicities. You know, some people use race and ethnicity interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. While race is more about how society sees and categorizes you, ethnicity is more about how you identify yourself based on shared characteristics like language, history, or even food. So let's break this down. Suppose you're born in America and you speak English, but your family's from Mexico and speaks Spanish at home, eats Mexican food, and celebrates Mexican holidays. Your race might be categorized by others as Hispanic or Latino based on social perceptions, but your ethnicity, how you might identify culturally, could be Mexican American. Ethnicity can be a source of pride, a connection to a rich history, and a set of traditions that give people a sense of belonging. But it's not always that straightforward, because what if your family has been in America for generations and you don't speak the language of your ancestors? What if you've never even visited that country? Does that make you less of that ethnicity? Not necessarily. Ethnicity can be fluid. It's not just about where you or your family came from. It's also about the cultural practices that you engage in and how you personally identify. Now let's talk about how ethnicity can change over time. Think about how immigrants from many different countries sometimes adopt the culture of the place they've moved to. Their kids might grow up speaking a different language, eating different foods, or celebrating different holidays. This doesn't mean they've lost their ethnicity. It means their experience has added another layer to it. They can identify with the culture of their new country while also keeping a connection to their roots. And here's where it gets even more complex. What about people who belong to multiple ethnic groups? What if your mom is Italian and your dad is Nigerian? That's a blend of two rich histories, languages, and sets of traditions. How cool is that? You get to be part of both worlds. Or you might also face challenges because society often wants to put people into single, easy to understand categories, and life's not that simple. Another thing to consider is how society or politics can shape our understanding of ethnicity. Certain policies or social attitudes can make people feel like they have to choose one part of their ethnicity over another or even reject a part of who they are. That's not fair. And it shows how much work we have to do to make society more accepting of diverse identities. So when we're talking about ethnicity, remember it's a term that can be very personal. It can be a source of pride and community, but it can also be complicated. It's shaped by a mix of factors like history, language, and personal choice. It's not something that can be easily defined or put into a neat box, and that's what makes it such an interesting topic to explore. All right, everyone. Now that we've laid the groundwork by exploring the definitions of race and ethnicity, let's venture into how the concept of race actually came about in the first place. Now, many people might think that the concept of race has been around forever, as long as people have been aware of differences in skin color or facial features, but that's not the case. The concept of race, as we understand it today, has roots in more recent human history, and it didn't develop in a vacuum. It was closely tied to the events, beliefs, and power structures of particular periods, especially the era of European colonialism. Let's go back a bit in time, all the way to the age of exploration. We're talking about the 15th and the 16th centuries, when European nations like Spain and Portugal began exploring other parts of the world. These nations started to colonize territories in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Now, these Europeans, onto people who looked different from them, spoke different languages, and had different ways of life. The Europeans started to categorize these people, not just based on geography, but also based on characteristics like skin color and other physical feature. This was the beginning of race as a concept used to categorize and rank people. Why'd they do this? Well, it's not a comfortable truth, but one main reason was to justify exploitation. They started to create a belief system that said certain races were naturally superior, others were inferior. This made it easier to justify things like slavery, forced labor, and taking land from native populations. This idea that some races were better than others wasn't based on any scientific fact. It was about maintaining power. Well, here's where it gets even more complicated. The idea of race kept changing over time. Like during the 19th century, for example, the concept of race got tangled up with the emergence of scientific theories. Some scientists tried to prove that there were biological differences between races to justify social and economic inequalities. But remember, we've already discussed how that's been debunked by modern genetics. Yet the idea persists in society because it has been used to justify so many actions and policies throughout history. You see, the concept of race has always been adaptable. It changes depending on what those in power need it to mean. And while we like to think that we've moved past some of the darker periods of history where race was used to justify horrendous actions, the truth is, the lingering effects of those ideas still impact us today. They've left a legacy that we can see in stereotypes, social systems, and even in our own unconscious biases. Understanding the origin of the concept of race helps us understand not just history, but also the present. It helps us understand why people think a certain way, why certain prejudices exist, and why we categorize people the way we do. That understanding, my friends, is the first step in addressing the inequality and prejudice that exists today. Okay, folks, here we go. In our previous lectures, we've looked at what race is and isn't, what ethnicity means, and how the concept of race originated, especially during times of exploration and colonialism. Now let's zero in on the role that science, or rather, the misuse of science, has played in shaping our ideas about race. When we talk about science here, it's important to note we're not just talking about biology or genetics, but also anthropology, sociology, and other disciplines that have contributed to our understanding or misunderstanding of race. Let's go back to the 19th century, a time when people were obsessed with categorizing things. Plants, animals, minerals, you name it, they wanted to categorize it. And unfortunately, this categorization craze also extended to human beings. Scientists of that era, many of whom were influenced by the social and political norms of their time, began to classify humans into different races. They often use things like skull measurements or skin color as markers, but the problem was that these were often arbitrary markers, not indications of significant genetic differences. Now why is this a big deal? Because this so-called scientific approach to race provided a sort of official stamp of approval to social and cultural prejudices that already existed. It gave people in positions of power the tools to say, look, science says we're different, so it's okay for us to treat different groups of people differently. And that line of thinking led to all kinds of harmful policies and beliefs. Everything from segregation to forced sterilization to the extreme atrocities committed during periods like the Holocaust. Fast forward to the 20th century, and we've got the discovery of DNA, which revolutionized our understanding of human genetics. And guess what? As we've discussed, it turns out that all humans are 99.9 genetically similar. This has debunked the idea that races are distinct biological categories, but old ideas die hard. Even today, you sometimes hear people misuse scientific terms or cherry-pick data to support prejudiced views. But here's something else to consider. Despite the misuse of science to promote harmful beliefs, science can also be a tool for good. It can help us understand how things like social stress and access to healthcare affect different communities. And he can help us break down stereotypes and prejudices by showing us how much we all have in common. But, and this is crucial, science isn't neutral. How scientific studies are designed, what questions get asked, and how the data gets interpreted can all be influenced by the same prejudices and social structures that science has sometimes been used to justify. That means we have to be critical consumers of scientific information, especially when it comes to something as complex and charged as race. All right, class, let's get started. So far, we've been down some fascinating and complex avenues exploring what race is, how the concept originated, how science has played a role in shaping our understanding. Now we're going to look more closely at the idea that race is a social construct. Remember, just because race isn't a biological reality doesn't mean it's not real in a social sense. In fact, the social impact of race is incredibly tangible, affecting everything from job opportunities to life expectancy. Well, see, when we say that race is a social construct, we mean that it's an idea created and perpetuated by society. It's not based on any inherent, unchanging truths about human beings. Rather, it's based on a set of beliefs and assumptions that have been passed down through generations. These beliefs become institutionalized, meaning they shape our laws, our education, our healthcare, and virtually every other part of society. Take, for example, the census. You know, that survey that comes around every 10 years asking all kinds of questions, including one's race. The way we're asked about race on the census has changed dramatically over time, reflecting shifts in social attitudes. Early census had categories that reflected prejudiced views and pseudoscience at the time. Fast forward to today and the categories are still shifting, trying to be more inclusive or accurate. But the point is that even our government's understanding of race changes over time, influenced by social and political factors. Now let's talk about how the social construction of race affects everyday life. Imagine you're applying for a job. Your qualifications are just one factor. Studies have shown that names that sound stereotypically black or Hispanic are less likely to get callbacks compared to names that sound stereotypically white. That's racial bias in action, and it's a result of socially constructed ideas about race. And let's not forget about the school to prison pipeline. In many places, black and Hispanic students face harsher punishments compared to their white counterparts for the same behavior. This feeds into a system where minority students are more likely to end up in juvenile detention centers and eventually prisons. Again, this is a result of socially constructed ideas about who is dangerous or disruptive. Okay, one more critical point. Just because race is a social construct doesn't mean we can just choose to ignore it. Like some people argue when they say they're colorblind. Ignoring race means ignoring the systemic issues that people face because of it. It's not the differences in skin color that create inequality. It's how those differences are interpreted and acted upon in society. Welcome back, everyone. Up until this point, we've tackled some complex topics such as the social construction of race, the role of science, and the origins of racial concepts. But now we're going to add another layer to this, and that's intersectionality. Now, you might have heard this term thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean? Intersectionality is the idea that various forms of identity like race, gender, class, sexual orientation, and disability, among others, don't exist separate from each other, but are interwoven and mutually constructing. In other words, people's lives are shaped by multiple interconnected systems of power and oppression. So, why is this important when talking about race? Well, consider this. The experience of a black man in America is not just shaped by his race, but also by his gender, his economic status, and potentially many other factors. If he's gay, that's another layer. If he has a disability, add another layer. All these things intersect to create a unique experience of privilege or discrimination. And let's use a real world example to make this crystal clear. Think about the wage gap. We often hear about how, on average, women make less money than men. But when you apply an intersectional lens, you see that the gap is even wider for women of color compared to white women. And it's wider still for women who belong to other marginalized groups, such as women who are LGBTQA. And now, intersectionality isn't just about adding up different forms of discrimination to see how bad someone has it. It's about understanding how different systems interact and overlap. For example, a Latina woman might face sexism in her community, but also racial discrimination in wider society. These experiences aren't separate. They're interconnected and compound each other, creating unique challenges that can't be understood by looking at any single form of discrimination alone. The concept of intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a black scholar and civil rights advocate in the late 1980s. She introduced this term to address the limitations of feminist and anti-racist movements that often fail to consider how race and gender intersect to create unique forms of inequalities. Her work has been groundbreaking in helping us understand how systems of power are interconnected, not isolated. And it's not just about understanding problems, but also about finding solutions. When we use an intersectional approach, we can come up with more comprehensive ways to address inequality. It means creating policies and practices that take into account the full complexity of people's lives. For instance, if we're looking at healthcare disparities, an intersectional approach would mean not just looking at why certain racial groups have less access to healthcare, but also considering factors like income, location, and gender. Are there enough clinics in low-income neighborhoods? The healthcare providers give the same quality of care to patients of all races and genders. Questions like these get us closer to solving the problem. Hello again, everyone. We're about to kickstart another media discussion, this time revolving around how race is portrayed in media. Now, I know many of you love to binge watch shows or follow the latest movies, but today, we're not just going to be passive consumers. We're going to critically examine how these forms of media handle race, because whether we like it or not, media has an immense influence on shaping public perception. Alright, so let's start with stereotypes. Media has a long history of perpetuating racial stereotypes. Think about old cartoons or early Hollywood movies where characters of particular races were shown as caricatures, reduced to a set of exaggerated traits. Even today, while there's progress, we still sometimes see stereotypes pop up. Asian characters portrayed as super smart but socially awkward, or black characters shown as athletes or musicians but rarely as intellectuals. These stereotypes limit how we see people, and they can also limit how people see themselves. Now let's talk about the news. How racial groups are represented in news media can have significant consequences. Consider the language used to describe individuals or groups. Are they labeled as terrorists or illegal aliens? These labels carry weight. They shape public opinion and influence policy decisions. And often, these terms are applied unevenly across racial lines. Another important aspect is who gets to tell the story. For a long time, mainstream media was overwhelmingly dominated by white voices. This means that the perspectives and experiences of racial minorities were often either ignored or told through a skewed lens. Fortunately, we're seeing changes with more diversity in newsrooms and production studios, but there's still a long way to go. The representation doesn't stop at the screen. It also extends behind the camera. Who is writing these stories? Who is directing them? If these roles are not diverse, then it's unlikely that the stories told will capture the full range of human experiences. And when people see themselves represented in a wide array of roles, it opens up a realm of possibilities for them. It becomes easier to dream when you see someone who looks like you achieving great things. You know, some might ask, why is media representation so important? It's just entertainment, right? Well, not exactly. Media shapes our understanding of the world and the people in it. If your only exposure to a certain racial or ethnic group is through media and that media is biased, then your understanding is going to be flawed. Representation affects how people are viewed and treated in everyday life. It impacts job opportunities. It impacts interactions with law enforcement, and it impacts self-esteem. Now let's end on a hopeful note. Changes are happening. Campaigns for better representation and diversity in media are gaining traction. We're starting to see more racially diverse casts, more stories centered around characters of different backgrounds, and more responsible journalism that questions stereotype instead of perpetuating them. And each of us has a role to play in this, even if it's just being a more discerning viewer and questioning what we see. Welcome back, everyone. Today's topic is one you've likely heard about in discussions around race but might not fully understand: systemic racism. Now, systemic racism is overt prejudice or individual acts of discrimination. There's a whole lot more complex than that. It involves systems, processes, and structures that produce and maintain racial inequality on a large scale. It's not just about bad apples. It's about an orchard that's been designed to grow only a certain type of apple, so to speak. First, let's get something clear. Acknowledging systemic racism is not about blaming individuals who are part of a racial majority. It's about understanding that the systems we all participate in are influenced by historical and social factors that perpetuate inequality. This inequality can manifest in a variety of ways, from housing and education to healthcare and criminal justice. Let's start with housing. Ever heard of redlining? It was a practice where federal agencies would literally draw red lines on maps around areas they consider risky for investment, usually because they had a high minority population. Banks would then deny loans or offer less favorable terms to people within these areas. The legacy of redlining persists today, affecting home ownership rates and thereby generational wealth for minority families. Now, on to education. Schools in low-income areas, which often have a higher population of students of color, typically receive less funding than schools in wealthier areas. Why? Because school funding is often tied to property taxes. Less wealth in the area means less money for schools, leading to outdated materials, less experienced teachers, and fewer extracurricular opportunities. This sets up a cycle where children in these areas are at a disadvantage right from the start. Okay, what about healthcare? People of color often have less access to quality healthcare and are less likely to receive preventive care. Various factors contribute to this, such as living in areas with fewer healthcare facilities or having less comprehensive health insurance. And let's not forget that biases, both overt and unconscious, can affect the level of care one receives. All these elements contribute to health disparities among different racial and ethnic groups. Criminal justice is another arena where systemic racism is glaringly evident, from racial profiling and harsh sentencing to inequalities in bail and parole decisions. The system is rife with examples of racial disparities. The infamous war on drugs, for instance, disproportionately targeted communities of color, even though drug use rates are similar across racial lines. The consequences are long-lasting, affecting job prospects, voting rights, and more. So what can we do about systemic racism? First, we have to acknowledge it. We have to look beyond individual acts of prejudice to see the structures that enable and perpetuate inequality. Then we need systemic solutions, policy changes, educational reforms, healthcare access, and judicial reforms that aim to level the playing field. Change is possible, but it starts with understanding the scale and depth of the problem.